Well, hello, it's Pastor Smith. We have another devotion here today. This time, now we're starting to go through on our devotion videos this Forgiving Challenge book that we're all doing together. And today is day number 8. And we're just right here in the middle of the week of sin as we're going through that acronym of SCARS. Starts off with the S of sin. And guys, it's not going to be my favorite week. I'm going to tell you that much. Hopefully, as we get farther into the acronym, we're going to focus more on the grace of God. But, in each one of these days, though, it's impossible to leave out the grace of God, because when you talk about sin as a Christian, you talk about grace as well. And that's what the focus of today is. The title is Big Deal or No Big Deal when it comes to sin. And it invites us to reflect upon what our reaction is to sin sometimes. Do we say, no big deal? Do we minimize it? Or do sometimes we say, sin is a huge deal. We elevate it, maybe sometimes beyond what we should. That's the balance for us as Christians to be in line with what God thinks, to say that sin is a big deal, but also to confess that the even bigger deal is God's response to sin. And that is sending his only son, Jesus, to die in our place, to take the guilt of our sin away, to overflow his grace into our lives. So we have to be careful not to minimize sin. God takes it so seriously that he died for it, but then also, not to elevate it to such a huge deal that we start to think, there's no way I can possibly be saved because of the enormity of the sin that I have committed. So that's kind of the gist of today's reading, but then it gets to the challenge, and this is the heart of this entire book, right? Are the challenges each day, because we read and we learn, and then we sometimes have to put pen to paper, and respond, and sometimes kind of look inwardly, deeply inside of ourselves to see, well, what do I really think about sin? What do I really think about God's grace, and how does that apply to my life? So the questions today, it's elevator or minimizer. Do you naturally tend to elevate sin or minimize sin? Why? Well, I would say that depends. Because when it comes to me, and I'm speaking personally, you guys will have different reactions and different responses to the questions for yourself. But I would say, are you talking about my sin or somebody else's sin? Because I am more likely maybe to elevate the sin that someone else has committed, especially if it affects me. But if I'm thinking about my own sin, I'm like, I think I might minimize that a little bit. If there's a way, just speaking from my heart here, if there's a way that I'm going to go wrong on one of these paths in my own life, it is I'm going to minimize my sin. I'm going to kind of cheapen the grace of God sometimes. I think, well, Jesus died, so I can probably do this and I'll be fine. That's a dangerous path to go down. That might be your default error as well. Maybe we can commiserate together that's a burden that we share. So sometimes, you might minimize your own sin, and if somebody else does the same thing, you're like, flag on the play. That's something bad. Don't do that. So we can be kind of hypocritical when it comes to that. But then the last two questions really got me here. Are there certain personal sins that you feel more guilt about than others? I would say yes, especially, certain sins, I think more and more, if there are sins that I've committed that have really affected other people who are close to me. If I've wronged my family, my wife, my kids, that'll hit me harder. That'll haunt me for longer. If I reflect upon certain failures that I have had as a pastor, sinning against people here, that bothers me. I still feel some guilt about that, and love to hear the absolution that comes through Christ. But then that last one, is it appropriate to feel more guilt about some sins than others? You guys might disagree with me on this, but maybe you'll agree. But I would say, because we can say that if you've sinned one time, you're guilty of the whole law, right? You need Jesus if you sin one time. Of course, that's true. But there are some sins that do cause greater consequences in this life. They do more damage in an earthly way. And so I think I do feel more guilt, and I think it's appropriate to feel more guilt about those things. So as you work through these things here, these questions today, be honest with yourself. Be honest as you write down your answers, but then bask in the fact that God's grace is a huge deal. It's a bigger deal than sin. It's a bigger deal than your sin. God's grace covers it all. And that's the point of this forgiving challenge, for you to rest in the grace of God. Sin's a big deal. It's a big deal what Jesus has done for you. Remember that. Remember the big deal of God's grace. And may God bless you as you continue to read this book along with us here at St. Paul.